Good afternoon and welcome to the ROM. I'm Dr. Fahmida Suleiman, the Senior Curator of the Islamic World Collections here at ROM. I'm delighted that you are here. Thank you for choosing to spend your Saturday afternoon with us. ROM acknowledges that it sits on the ancestral lands of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Anishinaabeg Nation, which includes the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, who have been the original stewards of the land since time immemorial to today. This afternoon's event is made possible by the support of the Dan Mishra South Asia Initiative. Since 2017, this initiative has supported programming, special exhibitions, community engagement, and collection care work at ROM. It was established to explore and share the rich legacy of the Indus Valley world and to encourage a quest for the ancient origins of human understanding and knowledge. As some of you may have noticed, the ROM's South Asia Gallery is currently closed. This is due to a renovation project that is reimagining the ROM and making way for an expanded South Asia Gallery in 2028. Led by Dr. Dipali Diwan, Dan Mishra, Senior Curator of Global South Asia, work on the gallery is currently underway, and the team is actively thinking about stories and themes about South Asia's past, present, and future that are supported by the ROM's world-class collection and can speak to audiences today. Today's program is built around Ruby Lal's extensive experience in writing about the adventures and dynamism of women in the Mughal Empire, which lasted from the 16th to the 19th century and covered the northern and middle part of the Indian subcontinent. Professor Lal will present an illustrated backstory to her newest book, Vagabond Princess, and delve into politics, feminist thinking, art, and our times. You will also meet the fabulous Nur Jahan, who some have described as the only female co-sovereign of the Mughal Empire. And now, a little bit about our esteemed speaker today. Los Angeles Times finalist and Emory University professor of South Asian history, Ruby Lal is the author of Vagabond Princess, The Great Adventures of Gulbadan, published by Yale University Press. Selected as one of the most anticipated 2024 nonfiction books by Ms. Magazine and by History Today, Vagabond Princess has been lauded by the BBC, The Hindu, the Literary Magazine, Vogue, the Wall Street Journal, and numerous other national and international journals, magazines, and newspapers in the USA, UK, and India. Professor Lal received her doctorate in modern history from the University of Oxford, and a BA and 2 MAs from the University of Delhi. Professor Lal's previous work includes the biography, Empress, The Astonishing Reign of Nur Jahan, which won the Georgia Author of the Year Award in Biography and was a finalist in history for the LA Times Book Prize. And her remix of Empress for young adults, called Tiger Slayer, is forthcoming in August 2025. Professor Lal has received numerous fellowships and speaks regularly at national and international conferences. She has participated in a number of writers' residencies and has also published some fictional works. She writes not only about history, but also the process of writing about history. And we get to join her on this journey and ask questions about what the reliable sources of history are and how do we interpret them. Now, please join me in welcoming Professor Ruby Lal to the stage.
Thank you very much, Dr. Suleiman. Very generous remarks and soul-touching comments in a way, picking up on the practices and commitments that have fascinated me for a very long time. I'm very, very grateful to be here. Toronto is a very special place for me. I've been here many, many times, but in 2022, I was a fellow at the Jackman Humanities Institute at the University of Toronto, where I finished this book. And I just lived down the road, so I used to walk to Rome quite a lot. So I'm delighted to be here. Thank you again, Fahmida Suleiman, for those lovely remarks. I'd like to thank Mr. Ali Adil Khan for his immense generosity and interest, and to Dr. Dipali Diwan and Meenakshi Alim Chandani for this wonderful invitation. To Rom, to all colleagues, to friends, Sham Selvadurai, amongst others, for being here. It's very special for me. A very special thanks to Aparita Bhandari for agreeing to discuss some adventurous women, art and history. And thank you to all the guests and to those who were with me in the book platform this morning. So I will speak of my work today through the journeys of three women, two of them bold and adventurous historical figures of the 16th and 17th century India, and third, myself through them as a teacher, historian, and writer in our own murky and magnificent times. And I want to begin by hopefully taking you to London in August 1997. I waited with nervous anticipation as I skimmed through the card catalogue in the tall wooden cabinets behind the service desk of the Asian and African Studies reading room of the British Library. Earlier in the day, I had asked to see the 16th century Princess Gulbadan Begum's book, classified as Oriental 166. Gulbadan, whose name means rose body, was the beloved daughter of Babur, the itinerant founder of the magnificent Mughal dynasty of India, and the first and only woman historian of the empire. Her chronicle captured the little-known daily lives of ambitious men, subversive women, brilliant eunuchs, devoted nurses, gentle guards, captive women, and children who died in war zones. Nonetheless, Gulbadan's stellar writing was relegated to the margins of history, to a few footnotes in volumes on Mughal politics, war, economy, agrarian histories, you name it, all authored by men. Before I left India to do a DPhil in Oxford, I had seen a 1902 English translation of Gulbadan's work by Annette Beveridge, a remarkable British colonial era scholar. In a letter accepting the translation for publication, Beveridge's own publisher declared that the princess's work, quote, of unique interest was a little history. It is but a little thing, unquote. The little history of men and women's daily lives that the princess crafted is in fact a masterpiece that came out of an astute witnessing of quotidian struggle, grand ambitions, and more. Gulbadan was close to the people whose lives she chronicled. The result is a prose work that shines with unrivaled granular detail of a highly mobile dynasty. So on that August 1997 morning, as I waited to see the writing of this adventurous woman, I did not yet know the depth of her radical thinking or the daring life story tied to one of the greatest adventures in the late 16th century world. Oriental 166, Ruby Lal, came a gentle call. I went up to the reserve's desk, gave the person the counterfoil of the library slip. Bound in wine red leather with a gold rim was the princess's book, its fading color and margins showing the splendor of another age. I took it to my table, placed it atop a wooden book stand, and began turning the pages very slowly as if seeking blessings from a sacred text. It contained 83 folios with approximately 15 lines each. Each day, as I returned to Gulbadan's writing, I experienced a deeper affinity with the soft textures of the book, the light golden pages dotted with faint coffee-colored blemishes, the aging inside and outside, the words penned in coal black ink. And the Persian sentences. There were a few Turkish ones, as well as Hindavi, the language from which modern Hindi evolved. I could hear Gulbadan speaking, an heir to intermingled languages, a word here, a phrase there, making its way into a sentence in another language, like humans moving from one place to another, making homes in foreign lands. And I'm projecting this tent because it's a tent fabric from here. It's a symbol of royal movement. And so Gulbadan arrived in India in 1529 at age 6, the first Mughal girl to travel in a royal caravan from Afghanistan across the dangerous Khyber Pass and the massive river Indus on a way to be reunited with her victorious father Babur, the founder of the Mughal dynasty. As she came of age in mansions by the river Yamuna, strong women peopled her world. After the robust, itinerant years spent between Afghanistan and North India, Gulbadan came to live in the mid-1570s in the newly built red sandstone haram in Fatehpur Sikri just outside Agra, where 60 years later the Taj Mahal would be built. New regulations, including the seclusion of generations of women in grand new quarters, were put in place by Gulbadan's nephew Akbar, the third great Mughal emperor. Unaccustomed to such restraint, the princess, a highly influential matriarch by this time, devised a plan to travel to Western Arabia for the annual Muslim pilgrimage. She organized older and younger haram women and led them across the waters of the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea. From behind the red sandstone walls to the Prophet's land in Arabia, it was the first collective pilgrimage of women from a 16th century court. I knew nothing more about that journey, but the little I had read was striking. At the time, obsessed with historicizing and documenting the domestic world of the Mughals, I was focused on the singular detail that the princess had guided her companions across the seas. I didn't focus on the startling fact that the women had stayed in the Arabian desert for 4 years. Back then, I had no idea that a veritable political scandal had taken place while Gulbadan and her troop were in Arabia. In the British Library, as the weeks passed, I became increasingly immersed in the sheer physicality of Gulbadan's book. I touched the pages, feeling the tactility of the paper that she once held. By the end of the month, I had reached folio 83, nearly the end of the descriptions of the times of her peripatetic father and half-brother Humayun, the second Mughal emperor. I began to read the passage where Humayun was having a difficult conversation with his courtiers about his ambitious younger brother. The courtiers urged the emperor to give orders to blind the prince. The charges were serious: murder, terrorizing families, disgracing people. The order was executed at once, wrote Gulbadan. After the blinding, His Majesty the Emperor. I turned the page. There was nothing more. The sentence was incomplete, the book broken off. 5 years after Gulbadan returned from Arabia around 1587, Emperor Akbar made an important announcement. He commissioned a comprehensive history of his empire. This would be the first state-sponsored, hence the first official record of Mughal glory, called the Akbarnama eventually. It would be unmatched in scope. For this massive undertaking, he asked servants of the state and old members of the family to record their memories of Mughal rule. There was one woman among the invited writers, the enormously accomplished Gulbadan, now 63, a unique witness partaking in the ventures of her kin along with her own grand initiatives. The invitation produced stunning results. Gulbadan wrote effortlessly, as if she's speaking, animating people and what they did as she speaks. The genre of her text is unclassifiable. It is not like her father's poetic memoir, which she read and greatly admired, or the hagiographies of kings that she knew. Indeed, her book is not what Akbar and his historian Abul Fazl had in mind. They were not looking for the routine detail of peripatetic life that Gulbadan attaches to every momentous event. Certainly not, for unruly women, cross-dressers, enslaved people, and the jaw-dropping events of Gulbadan's later life. What the emperor and his chosen historian wanted was a document that verified the remarkable undertakings of Mughal grandees in full splendor, if you will, a divinely ordained imperium. Thanks to her intimate chronicle, I wrote what many have called the first feminist history of the Mughal Empire, highlighting its itinerant culture and the work of hardy and enterprising women who shaped the grandeur of their dynasty. For decades, experts had discarded this rich memoir, denigrating its complex form. In her text, events do not appear sequentially. She would reflect on older times as she wrote about new ones. At once glorious and complex, it is charged with feeling as the princess reflects on unfulfilled desire, anticipation in love and marriage, the simultaneity of war and life. Female experience centered here reflect a collective, universal human experience. So Mughal scholars have taken man as the key historical and hence human subject. Men make history, emperors, bureaucrats, warriors, sages, state-sanctioned annals, male-authored treatises, trade, wars are, according to them, the historical facts, and records of them the source of so-called objective history. The result is what we often get: dry, distanced, people-less histories. If women and other ambiguous figures make an appearance in those histories, they are an afterthought, a supplement to male grandness. So to purveyors of such histories, materials that are intimate, female and small moments oriented, or dwelling on emotion can hardly be a legitimate source of history. My own work, by contrast, explores why certain figures do not take center stage in Mughal history, but also how such ambiguous figures, women, girls, eunuchs, concubines, wet nurses, or spaces, harems, gardens, tents, and forms of desire are made deviant, redundant, or obscure in history. So when I was completing my second book on the girl child and coming of age in 19th century India, a brief stepping away from the Mughals to think similar issues, I received a one-line email from a trade editor, and this is what she wrote. "We do not have a definitive biography of Noor Jahan. You should write it. Consider why." Unlike queens like Cleopatra, Christina, Elizabeth, Noor Jahan was not from a royal family and did not inherit the right to rule. A widowed mother, she married the fourth Mughal emperor, son of Akbar. So this is one generation after Gulbadan. So Noor Jahan married the fourth emperor at the age of 31 and went on to become his co-sovereign. 3 decades after Akbar's dictate to cloister his women, his son and successor's 20th wife, Noor Jahan, was on view in the most male and public of powerful places. A Shia woman from an immigrant Persian family, she ruled alongside her Sunni husband, who had a Hindu Rajput mother, and presided over a population that was predominantly non-Muslim. Noor designed marvelous buildings and gardens, championed social justice, especially for poor and women, hunted killer tigers to protect her subjects, and went to war to rescue her husband from captivity. Coins of the realm bore her name. Noor sat where no other woman, Mughal woman, had sat before or would after, in a jharokha, an intricately carved balcony projecting from the palace wall from which government business was conducted. At last, her authority reached such a pass that the king was such only in name, says a contemporary court historian. Yet in the few scholarly pieces written about her, Her reign was locked up in legends of irrational love, a besotted and drunken husband bewitched by a beautiful scheming woman. Thus we knew her, and yet knew nothing about her. Nothing of her qualities of head and heart, her political acumen, her ambition, even her love. Nothing about the plural and dynamic world she lived in. So the process of writing a biography of Noor Jahan was far from easy. As I was saying to the book club, it was very painful. How was I to rescue this lush, glamorous, and powerful figure from the patriarchal and Orientalist cliches of romance and intrigue through which her life had previously been seen? How to open up senses of struggle and imagination in a gorgeously plural world that enabled a woman's ascent? I wanted to delve into the texture of love, poetry, war, death. I wanted to think what it means to be human, a girl, a woman, the mother of a girl, co-sovereign. The root of the word human is, in Latin, is humus, the earth, the composition of soil. How to describe the earth, trees, plants, flowers, rivers, what shaped Noor, and what she created? I slowly inched away from such perceptions of context to the position that context is not simply background, it makes for history itself, narrative itself. There's another point integral to my thinking and to the book and the books I've been trying to write, and in that instance about Noor Jahan. So I first met Noor when I was a restless 9-year-old growing up in Dehradun, India, 150 miles north of Delhi. I loved stories, and my mother had a bag full of wondrous tales. This is the young adult version, Tiger Slayer, beautifully illustrated by my dear friend and a phenomenal artist, Molly Crabapple. I won't go into the iconography of that book, but here it is. My mom called her Maharani, Queen of Queens in Hindi. Though the particulars of that day's story are hazy, what stayed with me was the grandeur of Noor's reign, her beauty, and the glint in my mother's eye. The stories of my girlhood were always open-ended, like the stream of consciousness style of Gulbadan. Depending on the audience, the teller, the listener, and the tale were all transformed. In his 1936 piece, The Storyteller, the phenomenal thinker, Walter Benjamin reflects on the division between story and storytelling. He suggests that stories are an act of rebellion, a claim of practice against a world of simple, additive information. The master craftsmen who travel far and wide, and the journeymen who worked long and deep, classically birthed stories. The wealth of experience, the changing audiences, the repeated storytelling made the story. And now consider biography in this light. Certainty marks the way. The architecture of biography is presumed. We must have a clear chronology, beginning with ancestry and birth and concluding with death, at the end kill the subject. I did not kill Noor Jahan. She was already lost and killed. The key question for me was how to craft a narrative in which the history of Mughal sovereignty was assembled in Noor Jahan, a minority woman, a widow, who wielded considerable power in a man's world. My work could not be a tepid expansion of the life and times genre. So when I began to share early writings on Noor with my students and the wider public, the question that kept coming up was, how did she do it? In other words, how did the Empress's extraordinary qualities, the twists and turns of 17th century politics, and the power of love combine to defy a time and culture that ought to have made the reign of Noor Jahan impossible? You need to be bold. a guest remarked in a public meeting in India. He wanted a firm declaration that Noor, a daughter of Persian migrants born on the road outside Kandahar, who rose to be the only woman ruler in the long dynasty of India's great Mughals, exemplified Indian syncretic life. That tells us something about the history and inheritance of India. As many of you know, in recent years, curriculum committees in India have expunged Mughal history from school and college curriculum. India's cultural touchstones are disappearing, leading to the idea of its history as a monolith with a glorious Hindu past and a monolith nationalist culture. No place for Muslims and other minorities, including lower caste, no women leaders, no plural ethics. The question, how did she do it, is powerfully answered by the questioners themselves. Where scholars see lack, many audiences and students have seen abundance. The reading, listening public is often perceived as passive, docile, and yet this is not the way I have worked in this expansion. I think it hardly needs to be said that the public the public square is hardly fixed. India today provides a remarkable example of an emerging forceful counter-public, and it's in conversation with various platforms of this publics that I have produced my new books, and hopefully I hope that they've helped to shape what gets shape the agenda that gets included in the public as well as in history. So how did she do it? On October 23rd, 1619, just outside the famous Hindu town of Mathura, where Noor and her husband Jahangir were on their way to Kashmir, subjects appealed to the rulers to do something about a killer tiger that had then been hounding villagers and forest dwellers. Noor Jahan mounted an elephant and settled into her seat holding her musket. The elephant handler led her along the sandy track towards the forest. Jahangir was on his own elephant, followed by a line of courtiers. Local hunters guided them and brought them to the point where the tiger usually emerged. Soon, Noor's elephant in the lead began groaning and stepping nervously from side to side. Jahangir looked on. Later, he would recall and record the moment, and in his words, "An elephant is not at ease when it smells a tiger and is continually in movement," he wrote. "And to hit with a gun from a litter is a very difficult matter." The tiger emerged from the trees. Noor lifted her musket, aimed, and pulled the trigger. The tiger fell to the ground, killed instantly. 2.5 years earlier, she had killed 4 tigers in a similar hunt, bagging all 4 in 6 shots. "Until now," wrote the emperor, "such shooting was never seen, so that the 4 beasts found no opportunity to spring or move. In sheer delight, he scattered coins over his beloved Noor." Mughal historians had remarked to me that the emperor hadn't said very much about Noor in his journals, the public record of his reign. When I went back to the journals in Persian, I noted 32 rave entries about Noor's hunting prowess. They were a sign of her co-sovereignty, amply understood by the emperor and by those in royal circles and by her subjects, because killing tigers had long been only a royal prerogative. Hunting revealed power. Stalking and shooting allowed a ruler to display his or her ability to tame the wild and to publicly assert their bravery. During hunting trips, a lot of information about rule and administration, etc., was gathered. And therefore, you know now why Tiger Slayer. Emperor Jahangir was not the only one in awe of his empress's hunting prowess. And so here we are in a museum. The celebrated court painter Abul Hasan, anointed Nadiruz Zaman, wonder of the age by the emperor, transcended his own limits or the limits of his work to draw Noor with a musket. Hasan had developed an eclectic body of work, drawing upon a wide range of European and Persian imagery and experimenting with drapes. He understood its expressive potential of drapery, what it can do to a human figure. And he had a gift for capturing the life force of his various subjects. But of course, he also sat in an established artistic Mughal tradition in which women were regularly presented in an idealized form, what art historians call the Naika mode, or the Hindi word for heroine. Hassan's portrait of Noor in watercolor and oils was groundbreaking in both style and content. The Empress stands confidently loading a musket. She's dressed in hunting attire, a knee-length tunic tied with a sash, tightly fitting trousers, a regal turban, and her famous ruby and diamond earrings. This unique work was finished, according to art experts, sometime between 1612 and 17, that is, in the early years of Noor's ascent as co-sovereign. Here, Hassan honored certain conventions of Mughal miniature painting and worked on a very small space, just 17 inches by 12 inches of paperboard, to reflect this whole figure. But in most other ways, he was daringly experimental. Showing a woman alone rather than in a group was a break with tradition. Hassan's decision to represent Noor as an actor, a doer, a defender, is extraordinary. Her loading the musket is a rare example of action in portrait of a royal woman. Her confident stance points to her skill with this weapon and technical know-how. An Islamic studies scholar was astonished when I mentioned Noor's hunting. She hunted? You mean she hunted? And it is recorded? What more do you need? Another historian I met at a conference in Zurich was stunned that Noor issued imperial orders over her own signature. He couldn't get over his surprise and wanted details of each of her orders. The range is no different from those of a Pacha, king, he noted. Let me add one more archival trace on Noor, and I can, of course, multiply this. Contrary to architectural conventions, Noor chose to leave her name boldly etched on one of the gates outside her Noor Mahal Sarai in Jalandhar, a traveler's inn on a busy international trade route where 4,000 traders, according to architectural historians' estimate, could stay. And despite this lush archive of Noor's reign, the question of lack repeatedly rears its head. So when I began research for my first book following that visit with which I opened these remarks here, and began writing a book on the haram and the domestic world of the early Mughals and Gulbadan at its center, a senior male scholar asked me, how are you going to do this? There are no sources for it. With Noor, the question reappeared in another guise. Confronted by the plentiful sources for the history of Noor Jahan, and by this time, of course, I had shaken the grounds of what constitutes sources, another male scholar said to me, a little more savvily, but isn't this representation? And which sources are outside representation, I had to say. What is not representation? Underlying the statement, there are no sources and isn't this representation, is a male disbelief in the possibility of feminine agency, creativity, and thinking. The comments symbolize the barriers that critical oppositional histories, feminist, anti-colonial, indigenous, face in combating and rewriting received histories, that is, the ones that are based on these state and official archives and with a capital H. The point is this. Our inherited privileges and prejudices, class, social and cultural capital, education, discipline, have conditioned and restricted our imagination, not to say our ways of knowing. What we need is an interruption of the certainty of these privileged ways of seeing, apprehending, and believing, what Gayatri Spivak calls a rearrangement of desire. For erased figures and histories that challenge the status discourse, even when the evidence is before us, a common reaction is disbelief, a position at once arrogant and paradoxical. For our writing, our living with figures that we carry to our teaching in the humanities, for our conversations, we must have a way to expand the imagination, not simply reinforce things that we already know. This is the demanding, slow work of history, work that requires looking where we don't habitually look, with outcomes that are uncertain. To question everything Adrienne Rich wrote almost 4 decades ago, reflecting on feminist futures, and I'm quoting her. To remember what has been forbidden even to mention, to do this kind of work takes a capacity for constant active presence, a naturalist's attention to minute phenomena, watching closely for symbolic arrangements, decoding difficult and complex messages left to us by women of the past, unquote. So 2 decades after my encounter with Princess Gulbadan's little book, I still pondered its missing pages. I had gleaned unparalleled detail from her writing, yet the incomplete manuscript always struck me as invitational. Gulbadan appears in the early pages of Empress, my biography of Noor Jahan getting ready to go to Arabia, as baby Noor was making her way into Akbar's India. During promotional events for Empress, my audience frequently asked about Gulbadan. And so I found myself contemplating 2 facts: the 4 years of her sojourn in Arabia and the lost pages of her manuscript. My research soon pointed to a huge controversy in Gulbadan's extended stay in Arabia. Sultan Murad III of Turkey, he was then the sovereign of the Holy Lands. And his forefathers, since 1517, that is roughly 60 years before Gulbadan's arrival, had conquered the territories in Arabia. So he was sitting in Istanbul, and he issued several eviction orders against her, which I discovered in the National Archives in Turkey. And 5 of these are preserved there. For Sultan Murad, the problem was that the prominence and public activities of Gulbadan and her companions was cause for concern. Ordinary folk stared at and crowded around the princess in all sorts of places, near the great mosque, in markets, in fountains. The excitement, the word that he uses is disturbance in his terms, spread to areas beyond the sacrosanct precincts of Mecca and Medina, to Karbala, Qom, Mashhad, and other cities where they traveled. The Mughal women's constant visibility and unwavering public commitment was indecorous, but the issue was more dire. What irked Murad was Gulbadan's protracted distribution of sadaqat in Ottoman Turkish, or sadaqa in Hindi, in Urdu and Persian, a word that he used in all his orders. Voluntary or beneficent donation, I believe, does not capture the depth of this word. Right, privilege, grant, gift, the word exemplified a moral sense, justice, righteousness, graciousness, hospitality, assistance for needy. Not only was sadaqat seen as the highest form of giving in Islam in that it elevated the giver, it was the very source of the authority of Ottoman rule in Arabia. So they were not direct descendants of the Prophet. And the grounds upon which they established their authority was to say, they voiced a claim on Arab lands by saying that they would be the protectors and servitors of all. Townspeople, farmers, Bedouins, visitors, pilgrims. Imperial protection especially mattered in a land with agricultural scarcity, water shortage, and competing political and religious networks. And so the Mughal women arrive in late 1577 and quickly become the talk of the town. They disperse sadaqah amongst the poor from faraway lands and in Arabia, in public spaces, in the house of God. Gifts and donations were welcome. Food was seen as, quote, the most essential form of assistance, unquote. Words of solace and small kindnesses mattered. Quote, guard yourself against hellfire, even by giving half a date. And if you have none to give, say kindly words, unquote. As servitor of the holy cities, Murad had the responsibility of taking care of all his people in Arabia. His authority hinged on this fact. And 1577, when they arrived, was a really tough year in Arabia. There were acute grain shortages. He had shortage of resources. According to one Ottoman source, he even struggled to find funds to mend the falling bookcases in a library in Medina. And then there were political tensions. And here you have the self-assured Princess Gulbadan, her almond-shaped eyes with kohl and strands of grey in her hair, resolute in making donations. Worse, the very presence of Akbar the Great as he was animated in the visibility of his haraman, the women of his haram. And this, of course, is tied to the Mughals' bid to project himself as a great pious ruler, which Murad III would not like. "Send them back," ordered the Sultan. From 1578, the orders kept coming. Women were indulging in, quote, "strange activities," Murad wrote in 1579. In 1580, he sent orders to the Sharif of Mecca, the highest key, a political religious authority. "Stop the distribution of alms," he wrote, "send them back." But the women kept up their work, finding fulfillment and freedom in benevolence. There was not a word from Akbar in response to Murad's charges, even though the Red Sea and the Indian coast were closely knit and in constant communication. It was after Murad's fifth eviction order in 1581 that he finally sent an escort to bring Gulbadan and the women back. In March of 1580, the women boarded the Zrao, or the Swift One, a ship, and headed south from Jeddah, near the port of Aden. So this is the constricted passage of Babul Mandab, from where you exit into the Indian Ocean. Their ship was wrecked. Following rescue operations, Gulbadan and her companions stayed in Aden for another 7 months. Nevertheless, with all these edicts, I found a stray entry on the side of the Akbarnama in the British Library that recorded the women's reluctance to leave. That Murad commanded the expulsion of Mughal women was a blow for the Mughal emperor. His aunt's pilgrimage was meant to elevate his status as the great Muslim monarch, vital to his bid as the possible millennial sovereign, because the Muslim millennial was arriving. It is perhaps for this reason that Akbar's history refused to record the details of what the royal women did. Instead, his own chroniclers that wrote about her Hajj, they wrote sanitized descriptions celebrating the homecoming of the royal aunt, an esteemed pilgrim, a Hajji, not someone who had infuriated two Muslim monarchs. Now, does this explain the mysterious break in Gulbadan's chronicle just after folio 83? Akbar had invited her to write so that she would elevate him. She would surely highlight her nephew's permission for her pilgrimage, which was as important to him as it was to her. But in doing so, she would describe the things as she saw them, in tune with the rest of the folios. The very virtues of movement would be celebrated, Arabia recalled, women's distribution of sadaqat highlighted. Progressive thinker, writer, and educationist Maulana Shibli Numani was certain that Gulbadan's book covered Akbar's reign. Translator Annette Beveridge noted that Akbar's official historian, Abul Fazl, likely, quote, read it and despised it. Now, consider a really important fact. Royal scribes routinely prepared copies of important royal works, more than at least. So Bayazid Bayad, a medium rank officer that Gulbadan knew, met several times, was also invited to write as a contributor to the Akbarnama. 6 of his manuscripts survive. Water carrier Bayazid Bayad, very important to the family, his works survive. Quote, "It was very rare that fewer copies of any manuscript were made," notes a distinguished Mughal book historian. Were the latter pages of Gulbadan's manuscript disappeared? Were they lost or removed? Why aren't there more copies of her work? If disappeared history is not a scandal, what is? In writing a biography of Gulbadan, as in my earlier works, my goal has been to stand with traces, fragments, and clues, to look where we don't habitually look, at the broken manuscript, the long years in a distant land, the one image from the British Library that shows Gulbadan holding her book. There's a lot of argument I had with the British Library on this one, and I can talk with you in the conversation. We discussed this in the book club in the morning. I lingered over the one-liners and breaks in narration, worked through pictorial iconographies and the morphology of manuscripts, seeking, quote again, Adrian Rich, to decode difficult and complex messages left to us by women of the past, unquote. The recurring reference to sadaqat, the castigatory term nameshru, this appears in his last order. It's on par with fitna, one of the highest damning that can be done, that Murad writes in his last edict. 2 lines on the princess's shipwreck in Aden, a Mughal officer's one-line report that the princess did not want to come home. Delving into the depth of Gulbadan's words, sitting with her electrifying lights, and the unexpected fragments in official histories, I ponder a history of disappearances and the layers of action that surround the void in the princess's book as well as in my own book. For that is what we have for most of human history: fragments, inklings, messages. To repeat what I said earlier, our writing, teaching must seek to expand our imagination, not simply reinforce things we already know. This is the slow, demanding work of history, work that requires dwelling on little histories. The crafting of critical history, I believe strongly, begins exactly at such points. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lal, for such an engaging and exciting presentation and for bringing these 2 powerful women to life for us. All right, so we're not finished yet. We still have more treats for you. I would like to now introduce you to Aparita Bhandari to the stage, who will engage Ruby Lal in conversation. After the conversation, there will be time for you to ask questions. And after the event, copies of Vagabond Princess will be available for sale, and Professor Lal will be around to sign your copy. Aparita Bhandari is an arts and life reporter based in Toronto. She has been published in a range of Canadian media, including CBC, the Toronto Star, the Globe and Mail, and the Walrus magazine. Her areas of interest and expertise lie in the intersections of gender, culture, and ethnicity. She created and hosted an insightful podcast series, Reflections on Royal India for the ROM, in relation to our exhibition, Treasures of a Desert Kingdom, which in fact included an interview with Ruby Lal, and which is still available through the ROM website. Currently, she is the producer and co-host of the Hindi language podcast Khabardar at khabardarpodcast.com, which discusses Bollywood movies and the Hindi film industry. I'm so happy to see these 2 reunited on this stage today. Welcome, Aparita, to the stage.
Audible?
Thank you so very much for that generous introduction. Yes, I am so delighted to be reunited with Dr. Lal, Ruby, okay, for Vagabond Princess, because we had briefly spoken about her when we spoke about Noor Jahan for the podcast, which you should, if you go to the ROM website, you'll be able to find that and discover more. Before we begin, I just wanted to, you were talking about critical histories, and it's so brilliant. Like I think about Gulbadan and I think about making her some good trouble, as our favorite U.S. political representative recently said. But I also wanted to acknowledge that we're talking about history. There's a current time that we're at where things are tumultuous. And we will open the questions up to the audience for a bit. So we invite questions, of course, and history is ever present. And given what's going on right now, certainly we'll invite questions, but opinions, if we can sort of keep to a minimum, that would be great. I just wanted to begin. I mean, you gave us this really tantalizing dip into this, which is great because now we can go and buy your book and find out more about Gulbadan. But could you just, you mentioned, so somebody asked you about Noor Jahan, and you sort of went on and wrote about Noor Jahan. What was your first interaction with Gulbadan? I understand you said you were obsessed with her, and you've been obsessed with her for over 20 years. But what was that first kind of instance when you said, oh, this is a character I need to follow, especially when you have this very tantalizing broken script where, you kind of want to know what's going on next. But what was that first instance of wanting to know who Gulbadan was?
Yeah, lovely question. I feel as though I'm in the 1990s all over again. I mentioned that I loved stories, and then I went to Delhi University to do a BA and MA, and I was very clear. Everyone that I knew, for all sorts of, we are talking about history here, for historic reasons, studied what is called modern Indian history. Right? There was an obsession about colonialism, post-colonialism, partition of India. All of these are very vital things. But as a student, I felt there was a disconnect, right? That we were losing what historians call the early modern, world, and in India this translates into the great Mughals of India. So I went and specialized. I lost all my friends to modern history, and I went and specialized in the so-called early modern or medieval history, which meant I had to learn Persian and the Mughals. But I tell you all this just to say that I was bored to tears. There were no women, there were no people. They were very dry histories. I read them. They are superb histories. Some of them are great agrarian and economic history, all of that. And it didn't relate to the stories that my mother had told me. And it's at that moment that some relationships between story and history were emerging. And so I was basically just browsing around in old Delhi and came across this low-price publication book series that prints, sources and translations, and I think it was about 90 rupees or something that I found Annette Beveridge's translation. That was my first introduction to Gulbadan, and I just got super excited, even in English translation. And I just began to draw a proposal. I just wanted to turn history upside down, basically. And here was my woman, right? So that's the first encounter. It's a very cerebral encounter.
Right.
And 20 years later, of course, the encounter has changed, right? I've seen other things.
Right. So you found this book, you find out about Gulbadan, and then now you have to source, but, people have discounted her. This history, women's words are often, as you mentioned, or that kind of oral history, that kind of storytelling that your mother told you about Noor Jahan or other people told you about Noor Jahan is often discounted. So how did you then go about piecing, because you've done it with remarkable, to trace her journey, to trace everything despite the lack of resources. So how did you go about tracing the life and times of Gulbadan as troublesome as she was?
Yeah. So I mean, as I said at a part in my remarks that, when I was traveling with Empress on the road, people started asking me about Gulbadan. So one of the things I must say here, just to be clear, this has been my passion, but I mean, when that editor sent me that note on Noor, I was really kicking myself in the back. I was thinking this should have been my idea. And I feel, as if she came calling, and I felt exactly that with Gulbadan, because this was not my plan to write this biography, right? I just wait for projects to come to me rather than go artificially at projects. So this book is my fourth book, right? And I have come a long way since to thinking about this. And it is, I think, that time that allowed me to ponder these two things that I was talking about. That is, why is her manuscript broken? And why did she stay for 4 years, right? In Arabia, people turned around in a month's time, even in the late 16th century. And it is these two enticements, if you will, that made me get back to the story. And the way in which I link the story. So why does she go on the Hajj, right? I mean, that is the critical thing. She goes on the Hajj. I call it Vagabond Princess to actually, in a way, underline, underscore, etch for posterity that a commitment to itinerant life was really huge in that time. Movement and migration in history have been big, right? As we know,
Even today.
It's everywhere. Only our national states will not allow that. So I think it is that commitment more than just. So the problem of the seclusion is this: that this is a woman in a tented lifestyle, right? Tented meaning not our picnic tents, but tents of tented cities, right? That's what we are talking about. And there is a spirit in that. The accessibility, the communion with plants and animals, right? It's a very different ethic of life from that to sandstone, right? So
when she comes to Akbar's.
when she comes to Akbar's place and then she leaves, right? So what is the meaning of life? Why is she going out, right? What is the meaning of freedom? I think this is the move I made in this book. In a way, I think freedom has been, movement and migration and freedom are two themes that I've explored in almost all my books. But here, it's a very big question for me. And freedom, just to be clear, I think, I mean, not only in the writing on Gulbadan, but also, this is the way I've come to understand freedom, that it is not forever, it is not always there, it's ephemeral, it comes and goes, there are moments you'll find it, but I think it solidifies something within you when it's found. And I believe that she found it in that long journey and in the acts of benevolence that she was doing, right? So the return is a return of a different person, although she comes to the haram after that. So in this way, I have met her new. I mean, I've kind of, with the sense of adventure, the quest for freedom, all of these. And again, I will say just one other thing. You said, how do I assemble? So there are these Mughal documents, but I had to get into the Ottoman documents. I had to understand what was the topography like, right? What was the land they were on? Indeed, what did pilgrimage look like? It does not look like anything you and I know, right? People think of the two-piece white clothing. No, women didn't have to do that, right? What were the rituals? What were they doing? Where were they distributing the alms? Who was around them? What was the landscape? All of this. What did the ships look like? I've been so obsessed with the ships that she traveled on, right? So that took a lot of, different geographies, different architectures, paintings, all of these kinds of things give you a sense of the adventure and the person.
I have one or two more questions and then we can open it to the audience, and there will be mics that can be brought to you. So just think of your questions while I ask these just leading questions. So you just mentioned topography and, could you just give us a sense of the time that we're talking about and the kind of, I am terrible with geography, like I remember some history, but so you've talked about Gulbadan, the daughter of Babur, Akbar's her nephew, and they've sort of come from Kabul, I believe. So could you just give us a sense of like the time, the geography, the sort of north, what part of the South Asian subcontinent we're talking, or even Asian, in fact, coming from Iran.
I'll actually link that with this big thing about movement and migration. So I do want to say absolutely, in point blank terms, I believe that every country on this earth is made by movement and migration. I mean, states will not like it for the reasons that we know, but I think that's the assemblage we have, right? And I'm a daughter of migrants who moved from Pakistan to India just before the partition of the Indian subcontinent. And I grew up hearing stories with such fondness, the invocation to the rivers that they had left behind, the tree that my grandfather, the fig tree in his yard in Swat that my grandfather left behind, right? The invocations of all of these. This is history, right?
Which is
this
very much
history
alive.
to me. And so, who are the Mughals? Why do they fascinate me? They fascinate me because, you know, the entire dynasty, we won't go into the boring details of the dynasty. Here's the really crux of the matter. This is a dynasty like most dynasties at that time are moving all the time. Babur, the so-called founder, really looks up to Timur's. He's one of his forefathers in Samarkand. He loses it. He establishes his ground in Afghanistan, where in a mud citadel, called Citadel because it was both residential as well as military base, Gulbadan is born. And then he starts looking towards India, right, across the river Hind, Al-Hind. And after his initial victories, the family begins to move. Not all together, they still keep Afghanistan, and then, you know, parts of Delhi, Agra, and then the expansion takes place. And the Mughals keep this ethic of, and Babur particularly is so devoted to tented life. He has no mansions, right? He has no palaces. So people think of the Mughals and they think of the Mughals of lore and memory. They think of the Taj and the Kohinoor, and you know, there is this. It's important to think, what does illustriousness mean when you move? Why do people want to move? And I'm not trying to paint a rosy picture here. I think movement and migration has always come with difficulties, but also there's a fulfillment of the senses. And so this is where they are. They move from Afghanistan on to North India, establishes Babur, then Humayun. They lose again. Gulbadan goes back to Afghanistan again. They come back again. It's with Akbar, her nephew, the builder of the first sandstone haram, that the so-called establishment in sandstone terms and classic terms, that is building cities and administrative institutions, writing histories, all these things, what historians call the institutionalization, that is making rigid, in other words, right? That begins to take place. And I think it is this kind of move between fluidity and rigidity that she's playing into, in our words, if that makes sense.
And what's contemporaneously, what's going on in sort of the rest of the world? Like, where are we at in terms of perhaps like what's going on in Europe?
So you have Elizabeth I, who's a contemporary of Akbar the Great. You have ships of slaves that are being brought across to the Atlantic. You have the Portuguese in the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea, and the Portuguese get involved with Gulbadan. I mean, she has a very massive negotiation with them.
Wow.
She gives them a town, only then are the two ships able to exit. So that's a beautiful story here. You have, of course, the Ottomans in Turkey that, we are talking about. You have, so this is 1577, right? Imagine the Americas where I live. You have indigenous populations, right? That's what we are talking about. But you have early sort of inroads. In the south, you have, in the south of India, I mean, you have tons of other fantastic dynasties, right? In the Kannada kingdom, in Western India, the Rajputs, the hill rajas of the northeast. So the Mughals, the imagination that Mughals take over completely and altogether is also false, right? I mean, it's over a very long, protracted period of time that, and with a lot of contest. I mean, there's a lot of heroic contests, to the power. So I think this is pretty much what's going on. We have, of course, James I's representative, Thomas Roe, who will then travel to India, and Noor Jahan keeps his seal overnight and refuses to give him audience. So he is very miffed with Jahangir, and his journals are fabulous. So there's all all of this that's going on.
Okay, I have so many more questions, but I'm going to open it up to the audience. Oh, yeah, we have one here. Oh, two. Okay, quickly. It's coming to you. Yeah, well, you can. Or there's a mic coming to you. Aman, Preet, hello.
Hi, thank you. So my name is Amanjeet, and hey, Aparita.
Hi.
Ruby, so your research took you all over the place, speaking of movement. You were in London, you were in Turkey, Iran, I think, for a little while. Did you find that, what was that process like of hunting down these sources, first of all, that are so hard to hunt down, and then you're traveling all over the place, and would you say it's gotten easier or harder over the years?
Yeah, so this is a nice, good process question where I can, as you can imagine, I can just sit, talk and talk and talk. But the sources are highly dispersed, right? I mean, they, because of the colonial connection, as we say, bought, stolen, and gifted. A lot of them are in the British Library, Victoria and Albert, pictorial stuff, Chester Beatty, Dublin, National Archives, Delhi, tons. A lot of the stuff I use is also printed, so I have access to those things. Because of COVID, I did not, I've traveled to Turkey otherwise, but the National Archives were able to send me the orders, so I have not, I mean, I've seen scans of these, not actual orders. My idea about the sources, I just, want to be, how shall I say, it's not about being clear, but it's about being an approach. I don't think any historian or any writer can claim or should claim to have dealt with all the sources, right? To me, the point is not all the sources. The point is, what are your practices around the sources, right? I always tell my students, sources, it's not as if they're sitting in the British Library or ROM or somewhere you go and you're going to get real history, right? There are many truths. The point is, I think, whatever the sources are, they are agile, they're tactile, right? What are your practices? What are your political viewpoints? Do you believe that you should ignore a source because you think it's inconsequential? Well, that's the one I would go after, for example, right? So I think this assemblage is a philosophical process, if you will, right? What begins, I get very attracted to things that are tantalizing one-liners, because majority of the time people will not look at that. They'll say, oh, it's only one line, right? And I will say, yes, but I want that one line.
So how do you unpack that one line?
How you unpack the one line is you begin to decode. Why is there one line, right? What, as I said, what are the layers of actions around it? What is it surrounded by? What is the text saying? Why is this an insertion? Is there a parallel text in which you have a longer one on this? And what does that look like? If not, why not, right? That kind of thing. And that may seem like context, and I would challenge that again, because people think, again, in art history, there's this kind of classic mode of backdrop and front drop, and I just think contexts are so agile, right? I like to build stories around contexts. So the story of, why is it, how many manuscripts of X are produced at the same time that Gulbadan was writing? How many manuscripts of X are produced just after or before? What did she have in her library, right? All this people will think is context, but to me, that really sorts out the puzzle of that missing pages in some ways. Is that relatable? So that's the thing. I also I've been trained as a textualist, but in the last 10 or 15 years, I've been sitting with art historians very dedicatedly and really plodding through the iconography of art, such as in this painting. So since I said I didn't have the time, but let me just tell you very quickly about this painting. This is a part of the Akbarnama, actually. And this is about the circumcision of Akbar. There's that little Akbar, Akbar the Great that builds the Taj Mahal. And this is Humayun and Hamida. And the projection is, it follows the text of Gulbadan. And the British Library for years has been declaring it's not here, but it's in the book, that one of the women is certainly Gulbadan. And so I got together with 3 or 4 art historians, and I said, let's just now think, there is only one figure here that holds the book. I said, teach me about the iconography around people holding the book. And we came across, this is what I had to learn, and I put these here. In the Mughal tradition, almost always, the paintings of those holding the book were drawn of people who were esteemed, in other words, sages. This is actually Kesu Das, a contemporary of Gulbadan, who is shown holding his own book. Look at the position, look at how he is holding, and the color of the book, right? And here is a painting that Kesu Das draws of Father Xavier holding his book, right? So it is this tradition that then we had to study, and I made the claim in the book that, okay, sorry, we've lost it, that who else could it be but Gulbadan, and the British Library staff have agreed with me on that, following this book and following the first book. So these are some of the things I've been dealing with. Let me see if I can pull up this again.
Are there any other questions? Okay, we have one more, but we'll wait for the...
Oh yes, can I just share with you why this book slip here? This is, of course, as I'm a absolute passionate archivist. I keep everything because I believe if we don't keep our records, nobody will. So this is my decided act of documenting what I do. But I bring this up because I was at the British Library in London in the summer launching this book. And the British Libraries had a hack last year. So all the online sources have been taken off. They are back to requisition slips.
Wow.
So it was really an amazing moment for me to bring this up. They couldn't believe that I still had it. So, and the new requisition slips pretty much look like this. So just thought I'd share that.
There was a question. Yes, go ahead.
Hello. So you mentioned a lot that you had to collect a lot of disparate sources, and it was like putting together a puzzle, trying to put together this picture of Gulbadan's life. Now, I have some ideas based on what you've already said, but I was very interested to know if there was a specific question, if you had the chance to speak with Princess Gulbadan, if there was one you would want to ask.
I love that question. I've been asked that before, but I'm not rehearsed. I think I would want to ask her, predictably, not about the broken manuscript. I would want to ask her about her thought on freedom. I would want to know what she thinks is freedom, because that really drove me to write this book. I don't know how many people have read Saidia Hartman's book on. She's a scholar of African American women, and she recently wrote this some years ago, exquisite book called Wayward Women, which is really about anthropologists and sociologists who wrote about women who were bought in New York, and there were some police records for it, right? She went back to those very police records and to oral traditions to think about how those women were expressing themselves, right? It's a phenomenal book because there is nothing from their point of view. And this is what is now being called critical something ambulation. Sorry? Critical fabulation, yes, that's what it's being called. It's been said up in one of the reviews about my book. It's too much of a tongue twister and too dry for me. But I mentioned that because I think it's, in a way, a question of that kind I would want to ask, right? What were you thinking, right? Thank you.
Any other? Oh, yes, go ahead. Oh, we have a question at the back, perhaps, first. Okay, go ahead. Is there a question there? Okay, sure, go ahead. Yes, please.
I'm so sorry for stealing the question in the front.
No.
I will be quick. Thank you so much, Dr. Lal, and thank you so much for this great conversation. I had a question about reflexivity in your practice as a historian, because just hearing your talk, I love that you started off with a story and how you brought these two women in conversation with yourself. And as a aspiring art historian myself, I was really, I'm really in awe with the way you've kind of brought your own story, talking about the stories that your mom shared with you and how you've kind of intertwined this in your practice. And I'm just curious, how did you find that reflexive voice for yourself? And how do you work through that reflexive process as you acknowledge that we have our own political alignments or we have our own feelings, and obviously everything is shrouded by bias, but how do you work through that to ask your own questions and engage with the material? Thank you.
And can I add to that because that approach is critiqued, right? You mentioned how people question the importance of that aspect of history. So yeah, if you could.
Yeah, thank you very much for your kind words. I mean, that's a soul question. And I'll just tie the two together just to clarify what you just asked and then jump back to you. You know that, how are you going to do this? These sources, they were happening early on in my career. And very soon they were quietened because there was new direction that was being opened up. So those questions are gone. But I will say that I would not have done non-fiction history trade work. I couldn't have done, not I wouldn't have done, I couldn't have done without riding on that solid academic work that I did, right? And I still continue to do that. That's my challenge, to weave these very dense sources into the storytelling, right? That's the idea. And this process of, I mean, I think over time is the answer, right? When I was writing this Noor Jahan book, for all the reasons I said, that I decided to do the nonfiction history mode. So this amazing agent has represented me always, Bridget Matsi. She's just out of this world. When we were sitting and talking about Noor Jahan, she said, "So Ruby, what did she look like?" And I was kind of jolted. Historians don't think what she looked like, right? So I had to, on the basis of art, I had to imagine what Noor looked like, right? Questions like that may seem simple, but when it comes to translating them into writing based on pictorial evidence is not easy. Likewise, I was telling a novelist friend in India, he was reading my early draft of Empress, and he read, and we were talking. So I was telling him about this storytelling session with my mother. He said, "Ruby, but I would begin there," right? And so that's what happened. I ended up beginning there. He also said to me, "Can you hold back Jahangir a little bit more?" Right? I mean, these sorts of steps. And then finally, I mean, again, as I said to the previous question, there's just so much to share on these questions. So I don't want to sound obsessive about this, but I think stories and the mode, finding your ethics with it, it takes a while. One of the things, or at least it certainly took a lot of time with me, I'm very driven by words. I will spend, there are days when I just want to sit down with one word and I want to reflect on it and see how that works. So, for instance, in Noor, all the chapters were, because she loved pearls, I thought, can my book look like a string of pearls and each chapter a pearl that connects, right? Or with Gulbadan, there were very strong images. The image of the ship, right? The exit, the camels, the eyes of the camels. I mean, these were all images. So there are all these things that that get worn. And I'll say very, very quickly, because of this amazing fortune that I've had to work with, Molly. With Molly Crabapple. With her, it's a YA book, And, I had to bring out all the iconographies for an amazing surrealist artist about Mughal art. But the result was I learned so much about Mughal art with her. And I just want to, this is actually based on 2 photographs that she took. But I want to show you this one, right? So we have Abul Hassan's image that I talked about. And Molly studied that image very densely. What we don't have in the record is the act of shooting. This is partial image I'm showing you here, right? In the book, they are, of course, spread all over, all these images. How would she draw the seat on which she's sitting? How would it be suggestive of Mughal art and yet have a modern rendition to it, right? So we had to sit and work through all these things. She had to work out the sign of the musket that she's holding, right? She studied tens of these Mughal muskets. So it's been a learning process. And this, of course, is a very different book, the young adult book, because I've come to, so thinking the storyline. Young adult doesn't mean half adult, right? They are people where they are. So how are you going to write this book for them? Thank you.
So we'll just take the final question. Oh, no, okay. Final question, because we have a book signing to also get to where you can get these books.
Thank you. So Dr. Lal, first of all, thank you for your presentation. It's because of scholars like you who dedicate almost their life towards research, then only we can find out, personalities like Noor Jahan and Gulbadan. So thank you for that. And also thank you for your very profound and bold statements about how Mughal era is being perhaps erased from the history. One of my most favorite part of Mughal era is the manuscripts or the miniatures that have been produced, and I'm a lover of those. And we have a practitioner here, Sumaira Tazeen, whose works are in the ROMS collection. My question is, did these manuscripts or miniatures fill any profound gaps that you found in your research of Noor Jahan and Gulbadan?
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. They were critical, actually. They were critical to my scholarship as a Mughal historian. I feel there's a lot of, I think, we are sitting in the midst of experts here on art. I think I always thought I had a strong visual sense, and that came in very handy. As Shazia Sikandar would say, I was not looking at paintings, I was looking in paintings, right? Which means every move, every texture, even the production, I had to learn all this. And that enriched, I think, the text in some ways, because I brought all of that into the words. So I think Mughal art, architecture, they have been at the core of these books, only that it's an ongoing process, right? That I'm still learning, I'm still finding. And I was just saying to some colleagues that, the next book on my agenda is the Taj book, and of course the biography of Taj through all these amazing people that surround it, right? And I'm looking forward to talking to you about the Taj tonight. So I've seen that photograph of yours.
Thank you so much to Dr. Lal, to Ruby, for this conversation and closing remarks.
I wanted to sneak in a question, not to introduce spoilers. What happened to Gulbadan? Did she ever marry? Did she ever have children? Was she vilified by later historians? And did she die peacefully? What happened to her?
Yeah, she did marry. She had a son. And we were talking about this in the book club in the morning, that the sense one gets, there's few mentions of the husband in the context of basically chiding him, saying you should not be doing this. Oh. And the illness of the son is mentioned. So anyway, this is a longer conversation about kinship, why they're mentioned, why they're not mentioned, etc. She dies a year before Akbar, and when she dies, he does an amazing thing. He he puts the bear on his shoulder and walks a long way. So it's a kind of a filmic sign in my mind, right? Kind of going into the horizon. She was highly valued. Highly valued.
I'm very happy with that ending. Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Ruby Lal. Thank you, Aparita, for this wonderful discussion. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. As always, we have an exciting range of programs on the horizon at the ROM and hope to see you again soon. Please join us outside the theater in the rotunda for some refreshments, where you can pick up a copy of Vagabond Princess at the discounted rate, I think, of $22. If you're a ROM member, you also receive a discount. It's such a good price to get a signed copy of this book. Thank you, everyone, and good afternoon.